The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's ICU hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Laura Bennett clocked in at 6:47 in the morning, 18 minutes before her shift officially began. She moved through the corridors the way she moved through everything, invisible. 3 years at Sacred Heart, and that was exactly how she kept it. Deferential. Forgettable. The kind of nurse that patients trusted instantly and forgot to thank. Her scrubs were regulation blue, her ID badge held on a lanyard that had faded from navy to grey, and her hands, which had held soldiers while their blood cooled on foreign dirt, now held bedpans and saline bags with the same measured precision. The scar along her collarbone itched as she changed into her shift clothes in the locker room. Old wound. 3 continents old. She pulled her scrub top higher and let her dark hair fall forward, covering what needed to stay hidden. The jacket she hung on the locker hook was unremarkable, a fleece the color of old concrete, nothing special. But sewn into the lining, where only her own hands ever found it, was a patch. Faded green. 5th Special Forces Group. She touched it once, the way she touched it every morning, a ritual that felt more like prayer than muscle memory. Then she let her hand fall away and pulled the locker door closed. The ICU was already breathing when she arrived, 12 beds, 9 of them occupied, a landscape of beeping monitors and soft whooshing ventilators. The night shift nurse, Marcus, was finishing his rounds, and he nodded at her without breaking stride. They'd worked together for 2 years and never exchanged more than procedural information. Marcus didn't know that Laura had calculated the safe drug interactions on his med cart in her head, or that she'd quietly corrected a dosage error he'd been about to make 6 months ago by asking a question that made him double-check his own work. Nobody needed to know anything about Laura Bennett except that she showed up, did her job perfectly, and disappeared at the end of her shift. She reviewed the patient roster on the unit computer. 12 names. For she recognized from previous stays. 1 new admission, a 34-year-old male, admitted late last night with complications from a motorcycle accident. No name on the public roster, which meant either protective detail or something else. The chart read, no visitors, which meant something else entirely. She made a mental note of his room number and moved to the med station. The morning was routine until 6 minutes before 7 o'clock, when shift change officially began and Dr. Caldwell swept through the ICU doors like a man whose shadow had already conquered the territory ahead of him. He was tall in a way that had less to do with height and more to do with the space he believed he deserved. His white coat was pristine, monogrammed. Richard Caldwell, MD, Chief of Surgery. He'd been here for 11 years and had rebuilt the entire department in his own image, rigid, hierarchical, efficient in the way a blade is efficient. He spoke to the residents and nurses not with cruelty exactly, but with a consistent implication that they were fortunate to breathe the same air he did. Laura turned away as he entered the med station, moving to the supply cart with a kind of peripheral awareness that comes from years of reading rooms without looking at them. She didn't flinch when Caldwell's voice cut across the ICU. Morning rounds. Let's move. He said it like a command that had already been disobeyed. The shift change gathered. 3 residents, 2 RNs from nights, Laura, and 2 from the day shift just arrived. Caldwell began at bed 1, reviewing charts, asking questions that seemed designed to reveal what people didn't know rather than to learn what they did. Laura stayed at the med station, updating discharge paperwork, invisible. This was her role. This was safe. Everything changed at 6:58 when the monitor in room 4 flatlined. Not a slow drift. Not a gradual dysrhythmia. A hard, clean line. The sound of it cut through the ICU like a knife through water. The day shift nurse assigned to room 4, the Jennifer, young, competent but not fast, froze for the microsecond that precedes panic. Laura moved before conscious thought happened. She was at room 4's door, then through it, then beside the bed. The patient was the motorcycle accident. The 34-year-old with no name. His eyes were closed. His chest was still. Cardiac arrest. Probable arrhythmia given the presentation. Call code blue, Laura said to Jennifer, who was already reaching for the phone. Her voice came out level. Clinical. The voice of someone who'd done this before in places where mistakes meant flag-draped caskets. Get me a crash cart. Pads and monitor now. Where's his line? Left subclavian, Jennifer managed. Laura's hands were already moving. She'd positioned the bed, already had the patient flat, already was initiating compressions at exactly the right depth and rate, 5.3 centimeters, 100 times per minute, the rhythm of resuscitation encoded in her bones. Her hands didn't hesitate. They knew. They'd known for 14 years. The crash team arrived, resident first, then Caldwell, then the attending. Laura continued compressions, her rhythm perfect, her breathing controlled. The attending called for a 12-lead EKG. Caldwell stood at the foot of the bed, watching. She felt his gaze like a weight, but she didn't break pace. The pads went on. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation. They shocked. Compressions resumed. 1 milligram epi, for push, the attending called. Laura continued the rhythm, her shoulders moving with mechanical precision, her breathing steady as a metronome. Pain was information. Effort was data. The room contracted around the sound of her hands on the patient's chest and the beeping of the monitor clock. 3 minutes. The monitor shifted. Sinus rhythm appeared on the screen like a prayer answered. We have a pulse, the attending said. Laura kept her hands in position for exactly 3 more compressions, automatic, not conscious. Then she stepped back. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands were steady. She stripped off the gloves and waited while they hooked up the monitor leads and Jennifer started documenting. The patient's eyes fluttered. His breathing was shallow but present. Who did compressions? Caldwell asked. His voice was quiet. That was worse than if he'd shouted. I did, Laura said. She was already moving to dispose of her gloves, already reaching for the hand sanitizer, already preparing to disappear back into the ICU landscape. Where did you train? She paused without turning around. One measured breath. She'd rehearsed this moment for 36 months. The answer had to be unremarkable. The answer had to be something that closed questions rather than opened them. Maryland General, she said. Critical care certification. Advanced cardiac life support current as of last month. All true. None of it the whole truth. How many years in ICU? 8, she lied. Close enough to true that it wouldn't contradict any records they had. Not including the other 8 years. Not including the years that had been redacted from databases by people 3 administrations wanted forgotten. Caldwell's eyes were still on her. She felt them the way you feel a laser sight before you understand you're being targeted. Around them, the attending was already reviewing the patient's medications, the resident was consulting toxicology, Jennifer was updating the chart. The normal machinery of crisis and recovery had begun. Everything should have been fine. That's when the patient's eyes opened wider, and in a voice that was rough from intubation attempt but unmistakably conscious, he whispered a single word. Scarlet. The room didn't exactly go silent, but the quality of the silence changed. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something nobody was supposed to say. Caldwell's head turned toward the patient. The attending looked up from his chart. Jennifer froze mid-keystroke. Laura didn't move. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the word that had just torn a hole in 3 years of careful invisibility. She simply reached for a new pair of gloves and said, "He's probably confused from the arrest. Common post-resuscitation. Let's get a neurology consult and a CT to rule out anoxic brain injury." Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. But in her jacket pocket, where nobody could see, her fingers found the edge of the patch sewn into the lining, and for the first time in 36 months, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity develop a crack. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked at the patient. He looked at Laura. Then he looked back at his chart, but his eyes weren't reading anything. His eyes were thinking. Calculating. making connections between a name that shouldn't be known and a nurse who'd just performed a resuscitation with a precision that didn't match her work history. "Finish the workup," Caldwell said to the attending. "I want full imaging, labs, neuro consult." Then he turned to Laura. "You." "My office." "After rounds." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from a man who'd never had a command refused. Laura nodded once and turned back to the med station. She could feel Caldwell's gaze on her even as he moved to the next patient, even as the ICU returned to its rhythmic breathing, even as Jennifer resumed her charting. She had no idea what was about to begin. She had no idea that the single word a Green Beret had whispered would unravel everything she'd built in 3 years of careful silence. She had no idea that within 24 hours, Caldwell would start moving against her with the methodical precision of a man defending his kingdom against something he didn't yet understand but recognized as a threat. What she did know was that the patch in her jacket lining suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. What she knew was that she'd spent 3 years trying to stay invisible, and invisible people don't save patients with the kind of precision that made surgeons' eyes narrow. What she knew was that somewhere in this hospital, a man had just remembered her name, and that memory was spreading through the ICU like dye through water. The morning light came through the hospital windows, cold and bright and revealing every crack in the careful anonymity she'd built. Laura stood at the med station, updating charts with movements that were automatic, and felt the first tremor of something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the awareness that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried just because you stop moving. The morning light came through the hospital windows, cold and bright and revealing every crack in the careful anonymity she'd built. Laura stood at the med station, updating charts with movements that were automatic, and felt the first tremor of something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the awareness that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried just because you stop moving. 2 hours after the code, the overhead page crackled through the speaker system like an accusation. "Nightingale to the medication room. Nightingale to the medication room." Every nurse on the ICU floor stopped mid-task. Conversations dropped. Someone's pen clattered onto the desk. Laura closed her eyes for one measured breath and understood what had just happened. Caldwell had weaponized the radio. He'd given her a nickname across the entire hospital PA system, and now every staff member in Sacred Heart would be turning to their colleagues and asking, "Who's Nightingale? What's her story? Why would a surgeon publicly mock a nurse he'd just watched save a man's life?" She found him waiting in the medication room with a clipboard and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just moved a chess piece. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the pale clinical white that made skin look dead and intentions look crystal clear. Caldwell leaned against the counter, his Rolex catching the light, a $12,000 watch on a salary that should have maxed at $400,000, which meant his money came from somewhere else. "Your charting shows protocol deviations." He didn't look up from the clipboard. "You initiated compressions before the code was officially called. You issued commands that supersede your nursing license. You essentially conducted emergency medicine without an attending present." Laura's voice stayed level. The patient had no pulse. No electrical activity. 3 minutes without intervention is brain death, doctor. The patient is alive. That's not how we do things here. He finally raised his eyes. That's not your decision to make. You follow protocols. You defer to physicians. You don't freelance. She let one tear escape, not from emotion but from the sheer pressure of holding everything back. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, the words came out with the kind of precision that comes from having made life-and-death decisions in conditions Caldwell had only read about in journals. "The only protocol that matters is keeping the patient alive, doctor. Everything else is theater." His face reddened. The vein at his temple pulsed like a second heartbeat. He stepped closer, invading the space that was supposed to be neutral ground, and his voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a whisper but wasn't quite normal volume either. "I'm going to be watching you very closely, Nightingale. Very closely indeed." She didn't respond. She simply walked past him out of the medication room, and behind her, she heard him grip the edge of the counter hard enough that his knuckles went white. The next morning, he found her during rounds. The supply closet off the east wing, the one where staff kept extra linens and fur tubing, where nobody really went unless they were restocking. Laura was pulling 18-gauge catheters from the shelf when his shadow fell across the doorway and the door closed behind him. He didn't lock it, but he positioned his body so that leaving would require moving past him. This was stage 3 escalation, no longer public humiliation but strategic isolation. No witnesses. Just a conversation between a man with institutional power and a woman he decided didn't belong. "I've been reviewing your employment file." His voice was smooth now, almost conversational. That was worse than anger. Anger was honest. This tone was the sound of someone setting a trap. Maryland General has no record of a Laura Bennett in their ICU program. Not in 2020. Not in 2021. Not ever. "Where did you really train, nurse?" Laura's hands continued moving with steady precision, placing catheters into their storage slots. "My employment records with Sacred Heart are complete, doctor." That's not an answer. He stepped closer. The air pressure changed. "I'm reviewing credentials with HR. I'm pulling medical board certifications. And I'm finding that your entire employment history before 3 years ago is a ghost. No references. No prior institutions willing to confirm your service. Nothing." He paused. "Let that sink in. Which makes me wonder what you're hiding. And whether your presence here represents a liability that this hospital can't afford." She turned to face him. Her jaw was tight, but her voice remained measured. "You're welcome to review whatever files you can access, Dr. Caldwell." The emphasis on "can access" made his pupils dilate. He understood what she was implying, that there were files he couldn't access. That her credentials existed in a place his hospital administrator authority didn't reach. That someone, somewhere, had the power to make information disappear in ways that civilians didn't understand. "I'm recommending termination." His voice hardened. "For falsified credentials and conduct unbecoming the standards of this institution. Unless you start showing proper deference to the physicians who actually belong here." He waited for her to apologize. To panic. To plead. Laura did none of those things. She simply returned to organizing catheters with the same focused attention she'd give to a patient in arrest, and eventually Caldwell left because the silence had become unbearable and because something in her composure suggested she wasn't threatened by a man who only had power over her employment. That afternoon, the killing blow came. Laura was walking to her car after a shift in the ER float pool, a day spent drawing blood, taking vitals, watching trauma teams work while she stood behind the glass. The incoming shift was making their way through the parking lot, nurses carrying their bags and talking about dinner plans and whether the coffee in the break room was worth the effort. Caldwell was waiting by her Honda Civic, and he timed it perfectly so that 14 of the hospital's most influential nurses were within earshot. His voice carried across the asphalt with the precision of someone who understood how sound travels and how gossip spreads faster than light. "Bennett, you're being moved to float pool, effective immediately. Your ICU assignment is terminated. You'll cover wherever we need bodies. ER, med-surg, psych ward. Maybe you'll learn some humility when you realize that clinical expertise requires years of formal education, not just," he gestured vaguely with his clipboard, "whatever unconventional training you apparently received." The parking lot went silent. Shoes stopped echoing on the asphalt. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laura could feel the weight of their attention like physical pressure against her spine. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes before making a decision that can't be unmade. Then she let a single tear track down her cheek, not because she was broken but because she was a woman and tears read differently to the watching world than they read in reality. She was performing a very specific version of defeat. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, and when she spoke, her voice came out quiet enough to make everyone lean forward to hear it. "You have no idea what protocols I've actually followed, Doctor." Then she turned and walked to her car with her shoulders back and her head level, and her hand shook so badly that she dropped her keys twice trying to unlock the door. Behind her, Caldwell stood gripping his clipboard so hard the plastic made a sound like breaking, and several of the watching nurses realized they'd just witnessed something that looked like defeat but felt like something else entirely, something that made the air itself seem charged and dangerous. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened in the hours after, when Caldwell called an urgent meeting with HR and board members, presenting his findings about Laura's suspicious employment history with the confidence of a man who believed his institutional power made him untouchable. He made the case for her termination. He outlined the liability. He spoke with the articulate precision of someone who'd successfully destroyed reputations before and would again. What he didn't realize was that somewhere in Fort Bragg, a Green Beret captain with intelligence training had pulled Laura's hospital records and started making phone calls. What he didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the man Laura had brought back from cardiac arrest with movements that didn't match any civilian training, had a very specific memory of a call sign he'd heard only once before, in a briefing about a classified extraction in Helmand Province that his unit wasn't supposed to know about but did. And what Dr. Richard Caldwell absolutely did not understand was that he'd just initiated a sequence of events that would eventually bring a Black Hawk helicopter to the helipad of Sacred Heart Hospital with federal officers in dress uniforms and questions that would systematically dismantle everything he'd spent his career building. 2 days in the float pool was enough time to understand the mathematics of erasure. Laura moved between floors like a ghost that shifts departments, ICU to cardiac step-down to post-op recovery, never staying long enough to build momentum, never assigned to the patients who remembered her name. The hospital's schedule was a weapon Dr. Caldwell wielded with the precision of someone who understood that visibility was power, and invisibility was punishment. The 3 nurses who'd worked alongside her, who'd seen her stabilize the Green Beret patient and asked no questions, were reassigned to the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. night shift by Wednesday morning. Caldwell made the announcement himself during rounds, his voice casual, his smile thin. "We're rebalancing our staffing model," he'd said, and that was all it took. Patricia, who'd been on day shift for 8 years. Marcus, who had a daughter in middle school. Jennifer, who'd coordinated her schedule around her mother's dialysis appointments. Gone. Scattered to the graveyard shift like seeds windblown from a garden. Laura had watched them pack their things and leave without a word to her. That was mercy, she understood. Association with her had already cost them position and stability. Kindness now would only add her name to theirs. The board members received calls. She knew because Dr. Hayes from cardiology mentioned it to someone in the break room, not knowing Laura was refilling her coffee in the back corner. Caldwell's voice carried through 1,000 hospital conversations, a nurse with no verifiable employment history before Sacred Heart, questionable credentials, an incident with an unauthorized procedure that could expose them to massive liability. The words were crafted carefully, each one a small cut designed to bleed out slowly over time. By Friday afternoon, everyone in administration knew her name. Not as a competent practitioner. As a risk. Her pager remained silent. Hours passed where she wasn't called to assist, wasn't consulted, wasn't routed to patient assignments. The scheduling system had been rewritten with her name appearing only in the gaps, the spaces between real work. Float pool meant you existed in the margins, available but unassigned, present but invisible. It was a cage made of institutional policy and paper shuffling. Laura spent those 2 days observing. She watched the ER census board. Saw which attending physicians were working which bays. Noted the medication cart locations, the equipment inventory, the shift change schedules. Old habits. The kind of surveillance that had kept her alive in Kandahar and Logar province. The kind that made her dangerous because she understood not just what was happening, but why, and what was coming next. The multi-vehicle collision happened at 3:19 p.m. on Monday. 6 cars on Interstate 40, a tanker truck, emergency responders reporting multiple critical patients inbound. The alert came through the overhead system, not the typical measured announcement, but a code that made the entire emergency department lock into crisis mode. Trauma alert. All hands. The ER dissolved into controlled chaos, the careful rhythms of routine shattered by the sudden arrival of catastrophe. Laura was in the break room finishing her shift when the alert sounded. She moved toward the ER entrance with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before, but Caldwell was already there, positioned in the command center like a general arranging troops on a battlefield. His voice carried authority, that particular tone of certainty that made doctors move and nurses obey without question. "Bennett, you're on float rotation today. We'll call if we need additional support." It wasn't a medical decision. It was a statement of power. She was present but excluded, available but not allowed. The first ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer, and Caldwell had already moved past her, his attention shifting to the incoming critical patients. The attending physicians, 3 of them, all men who'd trained under Caldwell, who understood the hierarchy of his favor, began positioning themselves in the trauma bays. Caldwell gestured toward bay assignments. "Ross, you take bay 3. Henderson, bay 1. Martinez, bay 2. Run it tight. I'll be monitoring from command." 19-year-old David Chen arrived in the first ambulance with crush injuries to his left side, his breath sounds diminished on physical exam, his blood pressure already dropping from the compensatory shock that meant his body was running out of time. The paramedics wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3 where Dr. Ross, a man in his early 50s with steady hands and a reputation for following protocol perfectly, began his assessment. X-ray was ordered. Portable chest films to confirm the fractures. Ultrasound to look for fluid. The standard progression of diagnostic steps that made sense in a non-emergency setting, that followed the textbooks and the hospital policies and the structure that made Dr. Caldwell's hospital run like a precision instrument. But David Chen didn't have time for textbooks. Laura watched from the triage station 15 feet away, her view clear through the glass walls of the trauma bay. Watched David's oxygen saturation numbers, the way they climbed initially when they placed him on the monitor, then began their slow decline. 94, 92. 88, the numbers didn't lie. They never did. Pain was data, and these numbers were screaming. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the thoracic cavity, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart, pushing his trachea off midline. She could see the deviation of his throat, the way his neck veins were distended like rope pulled taut. Dr. Ross stared at the monitor. His hands moved through the examination with competence, his voice steady as he ordered the X-ray technician to get the portable machine down here now, but his eyes had that quality of someone waiting for confirmation before acting. Waiting for the image to prove what clinical examination was already screaming. Waiting for the system to validate what his hands already knew. The oxygen saturation dropped past 85. The monitor's alarm tone changed pitch, a higher frequency, more insistent. The kind of sound that meant minutes, not hours. The kind of sound that meant cardiac arrest was approaching from the distance like a train you could see coming but couldn't stop. Laura took a measured breath. She had no authority in trauma. She'd been explicitly removed from trauma assignments by the incident commander of this crisis. Her employment was under investigation. Her credentials were being questioned. Her very presence in the hospital was being constructed as a liability by the man who was now running this operation with his arms crossed and his eyes locked on every action, every decision, every moment of uncertainty. But David Chen's oxygen saturation was dropping past 80, and Dr. Ross was still waiting, and Caldwell was still watching from the command center, and the only person who could see what was actually happening was the nurse in the float pool who'd been trained to operate under fire. She moved toward the trauma bay. There was no hesitation in her steps. No uncertainty in the set of her shoulders. The movements came from muscle memory, from Bagram, from the aid station she'd operated in a converted shipping container, from the 100 times she'd done exactly this when the alternative was watching someone die while waiting for permission to act. "Dr. Ross, he needs decompression now." Her voice was quiet. Clinical. The tone of someone stating a fact, not a suggestion. Ross's head snapped up, his face flushed. "I didn't call for nursing input." The monitor screamed. 78, 76. The tracheal deviation was visible now even from across the room, David's neck twisting as the pressure built in his chest. Laura moved to her personal locker, the one she kept in the corner where the float pool nurses stored their things, and pulled out the MRE she carried like other nurses carried good luck charms. An old habit from a time when you couldn't count on supply lines, so you carried everything you needed on your body. She tore open the packaging with her teeth, extracted the flameless ration heater, kept the plastic wrapper. Walked back to the trauma bay and picked up the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. Her hands were steady. The kind of steady that came from having done this in worse conditions, with worse odds, with hostile fire making the ground shake beneath her feet. "What the hell are you doing?" Ross's voice had risen, his composure cracking as he watched her move with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Laura positioned the needle at David's second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Found the landmark her hands remembered, the anatomical certainty that 7 years of military field trauma had carved into muscle memory. The needle went in and the sound came immediately, a hiss of air escaping, the rush of pressure releasing, the kind of sound that meant a life was being pulled back from the edge. David's oxygen saturation climbed. 82, 85. 88, the tracheal deviation began to reverse. His blood pressure, which had been collapsing, began to stabilize. The monitor's rhythm shifted from the frantic chaos of decline to something that resembled recovery. The trauma bay went dead silent. Everyone froze. The residents, the technicians, the respiratory therapist who'd been standing by with the ventilator they might have needed in 30 seconds. Dr. Ross stared at the monitor like he was watching a miracle translate into numbers. And Dr. Caldwell appeared in the trauma bay doorway, his face the color of hospital walls, his eyes locked on the MRE wrapper in Laura's other hand. "My office. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the precision of a man who understood that the careful structure of his authority had just been revealed as ornamental, decorative, fundamentally unnecessary in the presence of someone who'd been trained to operate where doctors froze and uncertainty meant death. Laura secured the wrapper against David's chest, taped it in place with her free hand while maintaining pressure, checked that the air wasn't backing up again. "He's stabilizing," she said to Dr. Ross, her voice still clinical. "Call down for a chest tube tray. He'll need proper drainage in about 10 minutes. Ross nodded slowly, his shock beginning to crystallize into something that looked like humiliation. Caldwell was already moving. By the time Laura finished walking to his office, her pace unhurried, her spine straight, her face composed in a way that made his jaw clench, he had his phone in his hand. He was already pulling her credentials from the system. Already crafting the language for the formal investigation that would document her gross violation of protocol, her unauthorized intervention, her reckless endangerment of a patient. The chest seal from an MRE wrapper would become, in his carefully worded report, an improvised and untested procedure performed by someone with no authorization to perform any procedure at all. The fact that it had saved David Chen's life made it worse, not better. It proved she knew what she was doing. It proved competence. And competence without authority was the most dangerous thing an institutional power structure could encounter. She sat across from his desk as he made the calls. 3 board members. Each conversation shorter than the last, each one containing the essential information, liability, investigation, immediate suspension pending review. His voice was controlled, professional, the tone of a man protecting his hospital from a threat. But his hands were shaking. The emergency department held its breath as David Chen's oxygen saturation plummeted. 68%. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, stood frozen at the monitor, his hands trembling like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, faster and faster, but nothing moved in Chen's chest. No rise. No fall. Just the sound of a machine screaming into a body that wasn't listening. Laura moved before conscious thought could betray her. She'd been at the supply station when the call came through, another nurse, younger, panicked. The tension pneumothorax was a silent killer, air building in the pleural space, compressing the lung, collapsing the heart's ability to fill. Every second David Chen didn't breathe was a second his brain went without oxygen. She opened her locker on the 3rd floor. The MRE wrapper sat exactly where it had lived for 3 years, a faded tan rectangle, folded small enough to fit in her palm, tucked behind the backup stethoscope. During Bagram, she'd learned that field medicine required improvisation. A tourniquet could be made from a belt. A chest seal could be fashioned from plastic packaging and medical tape. She'd done both in a compound that was actively collapsing around her, while rounds pounded the walls and her hands kept moving because stopping meant people died. The elevator doors closed. She was alone. She allowed herself one breath, a reset, a threshold she crossed without permission. Her voice dropped. Not higher, not louder. Lower. The voice of someone who had given orders in hostile territory. By the time the elevator opened on the trauma floor, she was already unstoppable. The ER erupted into motion the second she appeared. Morrison saw her face and something in his own features shifted, recognition without understanding, the way a man looks when he glimpses something vast moving beneath calm water. Laura moved past him without breaking stride. The MRE wrapper was in her left hand. Her right hand was already reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her movements precise as a surgeon's laser. "David, this is going to feel cold," she said, her voice level as surgical steel. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce the procedure. This was no longer a floor nurse requesting authorization. This was muscle memory taking command. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, her fingers mapping the anatomy by touch alone. The needle slid in with a nearly silent hiss. That sound, that exact sound, had visited her dreams for 4 years. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. A chest that could breathe again. She pressed the MRE wrapper over the entry point, securing the edges with trauma tape from her pocket. She had to have grabbed it without thinking. Her hands knew what her mind was forbidden to remember. The oxygen saturation climbed. 72. 81. 91. David Chen's chest rose on its own. The ventilator's frantic beeping slowed into something almost rhythmic, almost alive. One of the nurses gasped. Morrison's face had gone the color of old bone. Laura stepped back. One measured step. Then another. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She looked at Morrison and waited, because now she had performed a procedure without physician orders on a patient not assigned to her, using equipment improvised from military field medicine, and there was only one way this ended. Caldwell arrived in his office with the file already prepared. He'd been waiting for something, any excuse, any opening. The emergency room full of witnesses was even better. Laura had performed an unauthorized procedure. Laura had accessed equipment not assigned to her floor. Laura had actively overridden the attending physician's authority. In the rigid hierarchy that kept men like Caldwell elevated, this was treason. The office smelled like leather and control. His desk was mahogany. His pen was fountain tip. The photo on his wall showed him shaking hands with someone Laura recognized as a state senator, though the recognition itself was dangerous. "You understand what you've done," Caldwell said. Not a question. His hands were no longer shaking. He'd had time to compose himself, to weaponize his authority into something sharp. "The patient was dying," Laura said. "The patient's survival is irrelevant to your insubordination." Caldwell leaned forward, and something flickered across his face, satisfaction at finally having ammunition. "I've pulled your credentials effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. But before that, I've launched a full investigation into your background." He opened a folder with the reverence of a prosecutor presenting a smoking gun. Maryland General has no record of a Laura Bennett working their cardiac unit. No employment verification. No reference letters. The nursing board will be very interested in how you've been licensed to practice for 3 years under false pretenses. Laura stood perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She allowed herself to breathe, which was its own form of defiance. "You falsified your initial employment documentation," Caldwell continued, warming to it now, the accusation like wine on his tongue. "That constitutes fraud. That constitutes criminal negligence. You endangered patients by misrepresenting your qualifications. I saved a 19-year-old who couldn't breathe, Laura said. Her voice was quiet. It carried the weight of someone who had made peace with the cost of truth. Using equipment you weren't authorized to touch, performing a procedure you weren't credentialed for, operating outside the medical hierarchy that keeps hospitals functional. Caldwell stood, extending the termination letter across his desk like a king handing down sentence. You're done here, Ms. Bennett. Or whoever you actually are. Laura took the envelope. The paper felt fragile. Everything she had built, 3 years of silence, 3 years of becoming invisible, 3 years of keeping Emma safe in a quiet house in a quiet town, folded into a standard termination letter. You're right about one thing, she said. Her eyes met his and held. I did falsify my employment history. But you're wrong about why. She turned before he could respond. She did not wait for security. She walked to her locker on the 3rd floor while the entire unit watched her gather her belongings. Photographs of Emma. A coffee mug from a patient's grateful family. The MRE wrapper that had saved David Chen's life. She reached into her jacket lining and felt the faded unit patch sewn there 4 years ago, 5th Special Forces Group, the green and gold worn soft as prayer. The patch was soaking wet. She'd been crying and hadn't noticed. Oakwood Cemetery lay on the north side of Raleigh, accessed by a road that turned into gravel once the manicured section ended. Captain James Bennett's grave was in the military row, his headstone granite with a characteristic insignia, Special Forces dagger crossed with an arrow. KIA Afghanistan 2019. He'd been her husband for 18 months. She'd known him for 6 years. He'd known what she was the entire time, and he'd loved her anyway, which was its own kind of bravery. The rain had turned everything the color of mourning. Laura knelt in the mud, her work jacket already soaked through. She didn't bother with an umbrella. The rain felt like absolution. I tried to stay hidden like you asked, she whispered. But I failed us both. The stone was cool against her forehead. She pressed her entire face against it, and for a moment she let herself break. Not trembling. Breaking. There was a difference. Breaking was controlled. Breaking was compartmentalized. Breaking was exactly 1 moment, and then she gathered it back inside. Emma's going to know everything now. The mission. The extraction. Bagram. Why I disappeared. Her voice came out shredded. She'll ask me why I gave up the life I built to save a stranger's son. And I don't have an answer she'll understand yet. She will someday. But not yet. The rain continued. Traffic sounds from the distant interstate were muffled by distance and weather. No one saw her. No one would. That had been the entire point. What Laura didn't know was that Caldwell's investigation had already triggered something far larger than his authority. His formal request for a background check on Laura Bennett had hit a classified firewall at the Department of Defense. A nurse with no verifiable history in a civilian hospital system, flagged through a hospital director's investigation, had automatically generated a counterintelligence review. Why was a civilian administrator requesting sealed military records? Why was someone using the name Laura Bennett working in the private sector? Why had the initial background check bounced? The questions were simple. The answers, however, were compartmentalized at levels that made Caldwell's authority look like a security guard with a clipboard. 2 days after the investigation launched, calls started. Quiet calls. Professional calls. Calls that made certain people in Arlington, Virginia, sit up very straight at their desks. 6 days later, a Black Hawk descended through the Raleigh skyline like judgment arriving on rotor blades. The landing skids touched Sacred Heart's helipad at 1,400 hours, and the rotor wash shook every window on the north face of the hospital. 2 officers in dress uniforms, army blues, no insignia visible yet, walked straight through the main entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that made security step aside without asking questions. They did not stop at the front desk. They did not check in. They walked directly to the third-floor conference room where Dr. Richard Caldwell was conducting his weekly board meeting, surrounded by hospital administrators who believed him to be the most important surgeon in North Carolina. The officers entered without knocking. One of them was a brigadier general. The other was a colonel. Both had faces like granite monuments. "We're looking for Major Laura Bennett," the general said. "Not a request. A command." Caldwell's face went the color of old paper. "I'm sorry, we have no one by that." "Check your employment records," the colonel interrupted. "She's a nurse on your staff. We need her immediately." The board chairman looked at Caldwell with sudden suspicion. Something in his expression had shifted, crystallized into something dangerous. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish dragged onto dry land. Before he could manufacture a lie, the overhead intercom crackled. "Laura Bennett, report to conference room 3, came the hospital operator's voice. "Laura Bennett, conference room 3 immediately." 3 floors down, in the ICU, Laura heard her own name and went very still. She knew that voice pattern. Military protocol. Someone had made a phone call in Arlington, Virginia, and the system had responded. She set down her full line. She removed her gloves slowly, deliberately, the way she'd been trained to move in the presence of command. One of the nurses, Sarah, good nurse, steady hands, stared at her. "Laura, what's happening?" "I don't know yet," Laura said. But she did know. She'd always known this day would come. She'd hoped it wouldn't. She'd prepared for it anyway. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. For floors. Her boots, military surplus, worn in at the heels, broken in by years of terrain that most people never saw, made soft sounds on the concrete steps. Tap. 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 The rhythm of inevitability. The conference room door was oak, expensive, meant to convey authority. She opened it. The general was seated. The colonel stood beside him. Caldwell was standing as well, and his face had the expression of someone watching his entire world collapse in real time. Laura saw the moment she understood. He'd initiated the background check. He demanded it. He'd wanted to expose her, and instead, he'd activated a counterintelligence review that had unraveled everything he'd been hiding for 4 years. Behind Laura, in the hallway, a 14-year-old girl in a private school uniform had followed her up the stairs. Emma Bennett stopped in the doorway, her hand still gripping the stair rail. She'd been visiting from her aunt's house in Chapel Hill, a planned afternoon off from school, a mother-daughter coffee run that had turned into something neither of them could have predicted. Emma's eyes moved from Laura to the officers to the medals on their chests, and her voice came out as a whisper that somehow carried the weight of understanding. "Mom's rank," she said, and her voice trembled in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pieces sliding into place. "She never told me she was a major." The general stood. He was 6'3", maybe 4, with gray at the temples and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He held out a file. Not a document. A file. Official. Sealed. Declassified. "Major Bennett," he said. "It's been a long time." Laura took the file. Her hands were absolutely steady. The trembling everyone would later mistake for emotion was something else entirely. It was the recall system of a body that had learned to process enormous information very quickly without showing any of it on her face. She opened the file. Presidential invitation. Medal of Valor ceremony. The Bagram extraction. Declassified. The operation that had cost her husband his life, that had cost her 14 years of anonymity, that had cost her a daughter who'd grown up knowing only half of who her mother was. It was right there, in presidential letterhead. "There's someone here who wants to speak," the general said. The door opened wider. A man in casual clothes, nothing uniform about him except the bearing, the absolutely controlled military posture that civilians could never quite replicate. He was in his mid-50s, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his collarbone, and when he saw Laura, his eyes went bright with something very much like tears. "Commander Michael Raines." SEAL Team 3. The man she'd carried on her back through 3 kilometers of hostile terrain. The man she'd kept alive by applying a tourniquet to his leg while directing CAS support, while treating for other casualties, while moving with the kind of precision that turned fear into action and fear into survival. Major Bennett, he said, and his voice shook. Just once. Just enough that everyone in the room understood what it cost him to say her name. He looked at Caldwell. Then he looked at the board chairman. Then he looked at every person in that room and recited her service record like prayer. Silver Star, he said. For exceptional gallantry in combat operations. He paused. Second Silver Star. For heroism under fire. He paused again. Purple Heart, for wounds sustained in action. Distinguished Service Cross, for extraordinary heroism in combat. Each medal became its own moment, its own weight, its own acknowledgement of cost. Before her country asked her to become a ghost, Major Bennett earned 4 medals for service. She saved my life on October 14, 2011. She saved 6 other lives that day. She extracted a CIA asset from a hostile compound under fire. He stopped. She was a major then. They erased her rank, classified her records, deleted her service. Not because she failed. Because she succeeded. The silence in the room became so thick that you could have operated in it. Caldwell's face had evolved from paperwhite to something closer to ash. The colonel stepped forward. Behind him came a woman in civilian dress, late 40s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent a long time making very important decisions. Agent Rebecca Chen, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. She set a laptop on the conference table without acknowledging Caldwell. She did not make eye contact with him. Dr. Caldwell's background investigation request triggered automatic review protocols for sealed military records, she said in a voice that was all business, all precision. That review expanded when we examined why he was investigating Major Bennett. We discovered a pattern spanning for years. She opened the laptop. Files. Spreadsheets. Timestamped documents. Dr. Caldwell has been altering patient records to hide surgical complications, Chen continued. Changing times, deleting nursing notes, modifying medication logs. He then sold those patients' information to malpractice attorneys who would sue Sacred Heart but never name him as the source of the error. He received kickbacks totaling $340,000. The board chairman stood. The anger that moved through his face was visceral. That's a serious accusation, he said. Yes, Chen replied. It is. 11 nurses were terminated or resigned under pressure for errors that Dr. Caldwell himself committed. Major Bennett would have been number 12. She turned the laptop so everyone could see it. We've recovered deleted files from his personal computer, traced offshore accounts, reviewed communications with 3 attorneys. Those attorneys have sued this hospital 14 times. Each settlement included the provision that Sacred Heart's names not be mentioned in the media coverage. Caldwell found his voice. It came out rough, desperate, the voice of a man realizing his power had evaporated. This is absurd, he said. I built this department. Chen cut him off without raising her voice. You built a protection racket, she said. The investigation Major Bennett's credentials inadvertently launched has already produced federal charges. Wire fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records. She closed the laptop. You're suspended immediately pending criminal investigation. The board chairman looked at Caldwell with disgust, not the kind of anger that burns hot, but the kind that runs cold and permanent, the way people look at something they've discovered under a rock they wish they'd never turned over. Security will escort you from the building, the chairman said. 2 security officers entered. They were not unkind about it. They were professional. But they were also very clear that Caldwell's time at Sacred Heart was over. As they moved toward him, Caldwell's eyes met Laura's. There was fury in that gaze, and desperation, and the dawning comprehension that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd classified as powerless. You destroyed my career because I asked questions, he said. Laura took one measured breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. Steady. Absolutely devastating. No, Doctor. You destroyed your career by weaponizing your authority against people who couldn't fight back. I just happened to be someone you couldn't bury. She paused. Her daughter was still standing in the doorway, watching her mother in dress blues, the clothes she'd been bringing home for the last week, cleaning, pressing, preparing for a day she'd hoped would never come and known always would. The difference between us is that I hid to protect others. You hid to protect yourself. Caldwell was walked out through the emergency department. Every nurse, every resident, every attending physician watched him go. The Green Beret patient, Marcus Webb, recovered now, standing with his team in the hallway, stepped aside to let him pass. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The rotor wash from the Black Hawk still audible on the roof told everyone exactly how much authority had just arrived in this hospital. Laura's hands, for the first time in 4 years, finally stopped shaking. What happened next was the slow, inevitable machinery of restoration. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. One that involved a White House ceremony, a daughter finally understanding her mother, and a parking lot strip mall in Durham where a man who'd once commanded a surgical department tried to convince strangers to buy supplemental insurance because it was the only thing left he knew how to sell. But here's what mattered: Major Laura Bennett, the woman who'd walked these halls as just a nurse, the woman who'd accepted humiliation without showing a single crack, the woman who'd hidden her veiler for 14 years because that's what the mission required. She finally didn't have to hide anymore. If you've watched this far, you know what it means to keep your strength hidden, to let people underestimate you, to wait for the moment when truth finally arrives. Subscribe for more stories of people who've served in silence, who've sacrificed everything, who've been right here the whole time while the world walked past. Like this video. Comment who you think should receive recognition for their hidden service. And check out the next segment where we discover what happens when hidden strength finally stands in the light.